I had been planning that hunting trip for months, telling myself that a week alone in the woods would clear my mind after a rough year. I picked a remote part of northern Minnesota, far from towns, far from highways, far from anything that could distract me. It was late October of 2018, the kind of time when the air feels sharp even before sunrise, and when the forest is quiet enough that every little sound carries farther than you expect. I was 35 then, still fit, still confident, still convinced that nothing truly bad could happen to someone who prepares well. I drove up there with my old truck, my gear packed neatly in the back, and the belief that I knew the woods better than most people. The place I chose wasn't on any popular camping lists. It was a patch of national forest land that almost no one bothered with because there were easier spots closer to the main road. But I wanted that quiet. I wanted to feel the stillness of nature around me without hearing other hunters nearby. I parked at a rough clearing near an overgrown trail, then spent an hour hiking deeper until I found a flat space between tall pines. The ground was packed with old needles that felt soft under my boots. The air had that cold, clean smell that comes only this time of year. I felt good, calm, ready. I set up camp the way I always did. Tent facing east, food stored away from where I slept, small fire ring cleared with a careful hand. When the fire finally caught, the warmth felt like a small reward. I sat there for a long time that first evening, listening to the forest settle, listening to the small tapping of branches shifting in the wind, listening to distant cracking sounds that were probably just deer moving through the trees. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. I went to sleep that night with no hint of what was coming. The next morning, the cold hit me the second I stepped out of the tent. Frost covered the fallen needles and made the ground crunch under my boots. I grabbed my rifle, checked my gear, and walked west through a narrow line of trees where I had seen signs of deer movement the evening before. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise, feeling the weight of the rifle sling on my shoulder. The forest was quiet in that heavy early morning way where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stop moving. I found tracks, fresh ones, sharp in the frost, heading toward a ridge. I followed them for a while, but they led into thick brush where I couldn't move silently. I decided to circle around and try again later. The day passed quietly, almost too quietly. No wind, no birds. Even squirrels felt rare. The air felt oddly still, the way a room feels when someone has just left it in a hurry. When the sun went down, I headed back to camp. I cooked a small meal on the fire, ate slowly, stared at the dark line of trees that looked closer than before, even though they weren't. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt tired in that heavy, slow way that comes after walking all day. I woke up sometime after midnight with a strange feeling in my chest. Not panic, not fear, just a tightness, like something had pulled me out of sleep before I understood why. I lay still, listening. First, there was nothing, just the faint movement of wind through branches. Then I heard something soft pressing on the pine needles. A slow, deliberate stepping. One step, a pause, another step. It moved near the edge of camp, not close enough to touch the tent, but close enough that I could sense its weight. My first thought was a deer, maybe even a bear, but the steps were too controlled, too spaced out, too quiet for something heavy, yet too purposeful for something small. I forced myself to stay still. I listened until the steps faded and the forest settled again. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the ground around camp showed faint impressions in the needles. Not clear tracks, but marks something had been there. I told myself it was probably just an animal moving through at night, something curious but harmless. I pushed away the unease and went out again with my rifle. I tried to focus on hunting, but every sound in the woods felt sharper than usual. Every shift of branches made me turn my head too quickly. I felt like I was being watched, but whenever I stopped and scanned the trees, there was nothing. Around midday, I found something that made the air feel heavier. It was a torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch, light brown, maybe from a jacket. It looked worn and weathered, but not old enough to be from years ago. The edges were frayed, as if it had been pulled free with force. Under the branch, the needles were disturbed in a wide patch, like someone had stumbled or fallen there. I stood there for a long time, staring at that spot, feeling the cold press against my skin. I had not seen another person since I arrived, and I had not expected to. That fabric felt out of place, wrong, even. It kept moving slower now. The forest felt different, less empty, more aware of me. The sun dropped earlier than I wanted, so I headed back to camp, walking fast through the darkening trees. When I reached the clearing, something felt off. My pack, which I had left zipped and tucked inside my tent, was now sitting outside on the ground. The zipper was open halfway. Nothing was missing, but someone had touched it. That realization dropped a cold weight into my stomach. I didn't make a fire that night. I sat inside the tent with my rifle next to me, listening to the forest breathe around me. Hours passed. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep. Sometime deep in the night, I woke again to the sound of footsteps, slow, controlled, moving around the camp in a half circle. The steps stopped near the tent, close enough that I could sense a presence standing there. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loudly. I kept my hand on the rifle, but I didn't unzip the tent. The minutes stretched out endlessly. Then the steps moved away, carefully, quietly, until they faded into the trees. By dawn, I knew I had to leave. I packed fast, checking everything twice, making sure I left nothing behind. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. As I hiked back toward the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The sense of being watched clung to me the entire walk, but I never saw anyone. When I reached the clearing where I had parked, I saw something that confirmed I wasn't imagining any of it. A set of footprints, human footprints, circled the truck. The ground was soft from frost melting in the morning sun, and the tracks were fresh. Whoever had been near my camp had been here too, walking slow loops around the vehicle, as if studying it. As if studying me. I didn't waste a second. I loaded my gear, got into the truck, and locked the doors before the engine even finished turning over. When the truck rolled onto the dirt road, I felt the first real breath of relief I'd felt in hours. I didn't report anything. There wasn't much to report. No crime, no clear proof, nothing except the quiet certainty that someone had been out there watching me, moving around me, getting close enough to touch my things while I slept. Maybe it was some drifter hiding out there. Maybe it was someone who lived off the grid, someone who didn't want strangers near their land. Maybe it was someone who just enjoyed watching people without being seen. I never found out. I haven't been back to that part of Minnesota since. I still hunt, but never alone that deep, never in a place without trails or other campers within earshot. What stayed with me the most wasn't the footsteps or the fabric or even my pack being touched. What stayed with me was the way the forest felt after that second night. Quiet, too quiet, like it wasn't just the trees surrounding me, but someone standing just beyond them, waiting for the dark to cover their movements. The woods used to feel peaceful to me. Now, when I walk through them, I sometimes feel that same tight pull in my chest, the same one that woke me up that first night. And every time I feel it, I remember the soft, deliberate steps circling my tent, and I remember how close they came without ever letting me see a face. I know people say the forest is empty, that it's just animals and wind and your mind playing tricks, but I learned something real out there. The most frightening thing isn't what you can't explain. It's what you can explain too well. Someone was out there with me. Someone walked around my camp in the dark. Someone touched my gear while I slept. And the worst part is knowing that if I had unzipped that tent, even just a little, I might have finally seen who it was. But I'm glad I didn't. It was the summer of 2017, and I had finally managed to get a long weekend off work. I was 28 at the time, and I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, pitch my tent near a small creek, and spend a couple of nights away from people, screens, and noise. I had been camping before, but always in the company of friends or in places with at least some other campers nearby. This was different. I wanted complete isolation. I left town in the late afternoon, my car loaded with gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra clothes, and enough food for a week. The sun was starting to dip below the trees as I turned off the main road onto a narrow gravel path that led deeper into the mountains. The closer I got to my planned campsite, the heavier the air felt. By the time I parked near a clearing beside the creek, the sky had already darkened with thick, gray clouds. The first few hours were relatively uneventful. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate a simple meal of canned chili and crackers. The wind picked up, rattling the tent poles, but I didn't think much of it. I went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before a day of hiking. Around midnight, the rain started. At first, it was light, just a few drops pattering on the tent, but soon it grew heavier, a steady downpour that shook the canvas and turned the dirt path into a slick, muddy trail. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain hammering the tent, the creek swelling with the sudden influx of water. It was peaceful in a strange, primal way until I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from somewhere outside. It was subtle at first, almost like something brushing against the trees, but then it became sharper, more deliberate. I froze. My first thought was that it was just branches moving in the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized the rhythm was too regular, too intentional. My stomach sank. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The nearest road was miles away, and cell service was non-existent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I had a small flashlight in the tent, but I hesitated to leave the shelter. Then I heard it again, scraping closer this time, circling the tent. I could hear the waterlogged ground squishing under whatever was moving. My pulse spiked, and I gripped the flashlight like it could somehow defend me. The rain intensified, beating against the tent like drums. Visibility outside was minimal, but the scraping continued, now accompanied by a low, shuffling noise. Something was moving carefully, deliberately, around me. I remembered the emergency whistle in my backpack, but I hesitated to use it. If it was a person, blowing the whistle might provoke them. But leaving the tent wasn't an option either. The fire was out, and I had no real weapon besides a small camping knife. I sat completely still for what felt like hours. Time warped in that tent. The rain blurred everything into a uniform gray roar, punctuated by the occasional loud crack as a branch broke somewhere in the darkness. I tried to breathe normally, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound of the scraping returned, louder and more confident. This time, it paused right outside the tent's wall. The reality of my isolation hit me in waves. There was no one coming, no help for miles. If this was someone with bad intentions, I was completely at their mercy. I tried to remember all the survival advice I had read. Don't panic, make yourself big, stay aware. I reached under my sleeping bag and grabbed my knife, holding it tight against the tent fabric, straining to see through the thin material. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch forever, something shifted. A shadow passed across the side of the tent, a dark shape moving low to the ground. I held my breath and waited. The scraping returned, then stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and the swelling creek. I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay frozen in that tent all night. I grabbed my flashlight, and with a trembling hand, I unzipped the flap and pointed the beam into the darkness. The light caught on something that made my stomach drop. Muddy footprints circling the tent, not quite human, the pattern irregular but deliberate, showing someone or something had been moving slowly around me. I made the only decision I could: retreat to the car. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, knife tucked in my belt. My feet slipped in the mud, soaking my socks instantly, but I kept moving. The rain was relentless, turning everything into a blur. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the car and slammed the door shut. I sat inside, breathing heavily, soaked and shivering, listening as the rain hammered the roof. For what felt like an eternity, I just sat there, flashlight off, trying to convince myself the marks on the ground were from an animal. But the prints were too deliberate, too large, too irregular. And the scraping sound, it had stopped only when I moved. I drove down the gravel path slowly, lights cutting through the curtain of rain, mud splattering over the tires. I didn't care about the campsite anymore, about sleeping outside. I just wanted to get to a place with people, somewhere safe. By the time I reached the nearest small town, the storm had passed, leaving a thick mist over the roads. I called the local ranger station as soon as I could. I explained the situation, careful not to exaggerate, just stating the facts. They told me that sometimes people ventured into that area illegally, campers, hunters, or even squatters, and warned me not to return alone. I gave them the location anyway, and a ranger said they would check it the next day. The next morning, I went back with the ranger. We walked the path to the campsite together. The tent was collapsed, mud-soaked, nothing left inside but trampled grass and waterlogged gear. The creek had overflowed in spots, washing away parts of the ground near the site. But the footprints, human footprints, were unmistakable. They moved in circles around the tent and then disappeared into the woods. No one had camped there legally in weeks. That day, I realized how lucky I had been. I could have easily been trapped, cornered, or worse, had whoever had been circling the tent decided to act aggressively. The rain and darkness had masked everything, making me vulnerable. But I had survived, mostly through instinct and the unwillingness to freeze completely in fear. I left the mountains that morning, gear barely dry, with a new respect for isolation and the unpredictability of being alone in nature. I never returned to that campsite, and I never went back to that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains alone. I kept my camping trips to areas with other people around after that. Even now, years later, I can remember the sound of that scraping in the rain, circling my tent, and the feeling of being watched with no escape. The memory is vivid, like the smell of wet earth and pine, the cold mud under my fingers, and the panic that grips your chest when you realize you are utterly alone with something or someone you cannot see. It taught me to respect the wilderness, not just for its beauty, but for its unpredictability. Nature is harsh, but people you don't know, can be worse. And sometimes, survival isn't about fighting. It's about moving, staying aware, and getting out before it's too late. I still remember that trip as if it happened yesterday, even though it was 10 years ago. I was 24, fresh out of college, and desperate to escape the chaos of the city. I decided to go camping alone in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. It was September of 2015, and I had chosen a spot deep in the national forest that wasn't marked on most maps, somewhere near the Stanislaus Wilderness. I packed my old green backpack with the basics: a small tent, sleeping bag, a first aid kit, a few cans of food, a flashlight, and a water filter. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The first day went fine. I hiked along a narrow dirt trail that wound between dense pine and fir trees. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I found a clearing near a small creek and decided it would be a perfect spot to set up my tent. I pitched it quickly, wanting to get out of the sun, and built a small fire with dry wood I found nearby. I cooked a can of chili over the flames and ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't alone. By evening, the temperature had dropped sharply. I zipped up my sleeping bag, laid down inside the tent, and thought I would sleep well. But I couldn't. There was a distant, irregular snapping of branches, something heavier than a deer, moving slowly but purposefully somewhere off in the darkness. At first, I told myself it was just a bear or a large animal passing by. Bears were common in the area, but the sound didn't seem random. It was methodical, almost like someone or something was circling the clearing, stopping, then moving again. My heart started racing. I lay still, listening, straining to hear anything else. Hours passed. I was cold, tired, and terrified. Eventually, I dozed lightly, only to be jolted awake by a loud, sharp crack nearby. My flashlight was inside my tent, and I didn't want to leave the relative safety of the fabric walls. I stayed still, trying to breathe slowly. The noise stopped, then started again, slower this time. It wasn't continuous. It felt calculated. The next morning, I decided to pack up and move. My nerves were frayed. As I broke down my campsite, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints leading from the creek to my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were large, heavy, and human-like. But I hadn't seen anyone else the day before. My stomach sank. Whoever had left these tracks had come close enough to my tent to watch me, and I hadn't even known it. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a hunter or someone else camping nearby. But the area was remote, and there were no trails, only rough terrain. I packed quickly and decided to hike east toward a ranger station I knew was about 8 miles away. My backpack felt heavier with each step, as if the forest itself was pressing in on me. By afternoon, the sun was lower, and shadows stretched long and dark. The forest around me was dense, full of thick trunks and tangled roots. I felt a constant presence, like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear twigs snapping behind me or hear a soft crunch on the ground. But when I turned, there was nothing. My mind tried to convince me it was my imagination, but every instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. At one point, I decided to take a short break near a small rock formation. I set my pack down and crouched to drink from my water bottle. That's when I saw it. A figure moving slowly between the trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out features. My chest tightened. It didn't run. It didn't hide completely. It just watched me. My first thought was to stay still, to pretend I hadn't noticed, but then the figure shifted slightly and disappeared behind a tree. Panic set in. I grabbed my pack and started moving faster, taking a less obvious path through the trees. I thought if I could make it to the river valley, I could follow the creek to the ranger station. I kept glancing over my shoulder, heart hammering in my chest. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me freeze. The figure, or whoever it was keeping pace. I could sense it. By evening, I reached a steep slope leading down to the river. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a road or some sign of civilization. The forest here was thick with undergrowth. Roots twisted through the soil, making every step treacherous. I stumbled several times, scraping my knees and hands. My flashlight was useless. The batteries were almost dead. Night fell completely, and the temperature plummeted. I forced myself to keep moving. Hours passed. Exhaustion set in, my legs shaking with cramps. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me. Not a bear growl, not exactly. It sounded almost like a human voice, distorted, angry, warning me. My adrenaline spiked. I ran blindly, slipping on wet rocks, falling more than once, scraping my arms and face. The growl followed, distant but constant, and I realized I had no choice but to keep moving toward the river. At around 2 in the morning, I stumbled into an abandoned logging path. It wasn't maintained, but it was wide enough to see some moonlight filtering through the trees. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road. After what felt like eternity, I finally heard the faint sound of water wheels and machinery. An old, small hydroelectric plant I remembered from a map I'd seen years ago. Relief washed over me. I ran the last 100 meters and found a small caretaker's shed with a light on inside. I banged on the door until someone came. It was a tired old man who had been checking the facility. I couldn't stop shaking. I explained, silently, with gestures, that I had been lost in the forest and that someone had been following me. He listened, then called the local ranger station. By sunrise, a ranger truck picked me up and drove me back to the nearest town. I filed a report, and they searched the area, but they found no one. No footprints, no sign of anyone else. I never found out who or what had been following me, but the experience left me with a permanent sense of caution. I never went camping alone in remote areas again. Even now, when I hike or camp, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is watching. The memory of that night, the quiet stalking in the dark forest, the heavy footprints near my tent, stays with me. It was a reminder that nature is unpredictable, that people can be dangerous, and that sometimes the scariest things aren't made up. They are real. From that day forward, I never underestimated the forest, never thought I was invincible. I invested in better gear, always carried a GPS, and made sure I wasn't alone in remote places. That trip taught me a hard lesson. Preparation matters, but even then, you can't control everything. And sometimes the real terror isn't a monster, a ghost, or a myth. It's just a person or something out there in the dark, watching, waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. In the summer of 2019, at 27, I decided to escape the noise of Paris and take a solo camping trip in the Jura Mountains of eastern France. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and the chance to disconnect. I packed my old green backpack with the essentials: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, canned food, a first aid kit, and my camera. I also carried a small pocket knife, something that felt comforting more than necessary. I arrived at the base of the mountains in the early afternoon, after a 4-hour drive through winding roads lined with tall, dense trees. The sun was bright but starting to dip low, and the air had that crisp, almost sweet smell of pine and damp earth. I parked near a small clearing that led to a hiking trail and unloaded my gear. Setting up camp was a familiar ritual. I stretched out my tent on a relatively flat patch of ground near a small stream, making sure it was stable and secure. I collected dry twigs for a fire and stacked them neatly next to a circle of stones I found nearby. By the time I had everything set up, the sun was disappearing behind the thick trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest felt alive in the evening light, the rustling of leaves, the distant cawing of crows, and the faint trickle of the stream. I started a small fire and boiled water for my dinner of instant noodles. I sat on a rock, the warmth of the fire on my face, the scent of smoke mingling with the earthy smells around me. Everything felt perfect, quiet, and safe. As the sky darkened into deep blue, I noticed movement across the stream, near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other forest animal, but when I looked closer, I saw a figure, tall, thin, wearing a dirty brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his face. He was standing completely still, watching me. My stomach dropped. There weren't supposed to be other people this far into the woods, at least not this late in the day. I told myself he probably was just another camper or a hiker who had taken a wrong turn. But the way he didn't move, The way he seemed to watch me like he was studying my every motion made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, focusing on finishing my dinner, but I could feel his eyes even from across the stream. My instincts told me something was off. After finishing my noodles, I retreated into my tent earlier than I had planned. I zipped it up, leaving a small opening to peek out. I could still see him across the water. He hadn't moved an inch. Night had fully set in, and my small flashlight only illuminated a few feet in front of me. Shadows from the trees flickered with the firelight, making the forest seem like it was breathing. I lay on my sleeping bag, trying to calm myself, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But every few minutes, I caught a glimpse of the man, always in the same spot, always watching. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of sleep, never fully letting my guard down. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of crunching leaves near the edge of the clearing. My heart jumped. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound stopped. Then I heard it again, a deliberate, slow shuffle, coming closer to the stream, closer to where I had set up my camp. I realized he had started walking toward me. Panic hit, sharp and sudden. I grabbed my small pocket knife and my flashlight, thinking if this guy tried anything, I had to be ready. The fire had died down, leaving just a few glowing embers, and the darkness felt suffocating. I peeked out again, careful not to make a sound. The man was now on the other side of the stream, still moving slowly, but with a purpose that made my stomach twist. He wasn't walking like someone lost. He was deliberate, scanning the area, stopping occasionally, as if trying to see if I was alone. My mind raced. Should I leave the tent and run? Could I outrun him? I realized I didn't even know the terrain well enough to plan an escape route. Minutes felt like hours. Then the shuffling stopped. Silence. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to see him through the darkness. That's when I noticed something in his hand. A long, thin stick, sharpened at one end. It wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense, but the way he carried it, and the slow, careful movements, made me feel every bit of danger. I stayed frozen, my brain racing through every horror story I'd ever heard about people disappearing in the woods. The rational part of me kept saying, maybe he's just harmless, but everything in my body screamed otherwise. I realized that if he was willing to approach a stranger's camp in the middle of the night, he was not harmless. Then I made a decision. Slowly, carefully, I grabbed my backpack and slipped the straps over my shoulders, making as little noise as possible. I edged to the side of my tent, staying low, and started moving toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. My heart was hammering so loud I thought he would hear it. I could see the moonlight breaking through the branches, giving me just enough visibility to navigate without using the flashlight. I moved quietly but quickly, zigzagging between trees to stay out of view. Every step felt like it could give me away. I kept expecting him to appear from behind a tree, the stick in his hand, ready to corner me. But the clearing was empty. I made it to the thicker part of the forest and paused, trying to catch my breath and listen. The rustling had stopped. I didn't hear him anymore. I continued moving for what felt like an eternity, my legs trembling, the underbrush cutting my arms and legs as I pushed through. Eventually, I stumbled onto a faint trail I remembered seeing when I first arrived. It led downhill toward a small road I had passed earlier. I followed it, running as quietly as I could, until I finally reached the road just as the first light of dawn touched the sky. I looked back toward the woods. There was no sign of him, no footprints that I could see in the dirt, no movement at all. Just the stillness of the early morning. I walked quickly to the nearest village, which was a few kilometers away. When I finally reached the small bakery in the center of town, I was shaking so badly I could barely ask for water. I explained nothing, just sat and drank, trying to calm down. The police later told me that the Jura region was known for occasional encounters with drifters, or hermits who lived deep in the forest. They said it was rare, but some of them were unpredictable and most avoided contact with people, but not all. I never saw that man again. I don't even know if he realized I had left. After that night, I didn't camp alone again. I still love the outdoors, but something about the memory of him standing there in the dark, watching me, has stayed with me. It was a reminder that the wilderness isn't always peaceful, and sometimes the scariest moments aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about people and the way fear can grip you when you realize you are completely exposed, completely vulnerable, with someone watching, waiting, and unknown. Even years later, I remember the exact smell of the pine trees, the cold water of the stream, and the shadows that moved like they were alive. That night taught me to respect not just nature, but the unpredictability of the world and the people who inhabit it. I learned to trust my instincts above all else, because sometimes survival isn't about bravery. It's about recognizing danger and moving before it's too late. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 23. I had been itching for a solo trip for months, wanting a break from the city noise and the endless rhythm of work. I chose a spot in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, somewhere I had only vaguely heard of from a couple of hiking forums. It wasn't a popular trail. The reviews mentioned that it was quiet, a little rough, and perfect for someone looking to get away. I liked the sound of that. I packed my car late at night, making sure I had the essentials: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, and my backpack with some extra layers in case it got cold. I even packed a small flashlight, though I usually preferred using the headlamp strapped to my forehead. I left around 5 a.m., hoping to get ahead of any traffic and be at the trailhead by mid-morning. The drive itself was beautiful. Rolling hills, dense trees, the smell of wet earth after some early morning rain. It felt like a different world, and I was excited to be inside it. The trailhead was small, almost hidden from the road, with a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for 2 cars. There were a few faded signs warning of the terrain and suggesting caution. I parked and unloaded my gear, double-checking my backpack to make sure I had everything. The sun was already high, making the forest look alive with shadows and highlights, a mosaic of green. I started walking, the trail soft beneath my boots, leaves and dirt giving just enough cushion to soften each step. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail was winding, bordered by thick trees and scattered rocks, the sound of a nearby stream adding a gentle, almost calming soundtrack. I was careful, noting landmarks as I went: the shape of a fallen tree, a cluster of moss-covered rocks, a bend where the trail split slightly. I had read too many stories of people getting lost, and I didn't want to become one. By late afternoon, I found a clearing with a small ridge overlooking the forest below. It seemed perfect for setting up camp. The spot was secluded, with a small patch of flat ground just big enough for my tent. I set it up carefully, hammered in the stakes, and arranged my sleeping bag inside. My stove was easy to assemble, and I made a simple dinner: canned beans and a small pack of instant rice. Sitting on a flat rock, I ate slowly, enjoying the silence. Birds occasionally chirped, and far off, I could hear the soft rustle of leaves as wind passed through the trees. I thought it was peaceful, maybe even comforting. But as the sun began to dip, I noticed the shadows growing deeper, the forest taking on a different shape. Shapes that didn't seem natural at first glance. Branches twisting in ways that looked like arms. Shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. I brushed it off as my imagination. I had spent enough nights camping to know that your mind could play tricks when you were alone. Night came fast. I lit a small camp lantern and arranged it near my tent entrance. The forest changed completely in the dark. No more details, just movement and shapes. That's when I first heard it. At first, it was a faint crunching, like twigs snapping under heavy boots. Some were off the trail, but not close enough to see clearly. I froze, listening. My heart started to beat faster, and I reminded myself that the forest was home to deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, and that noise wasn't unusual. But the pattern of the steps didn't feel right. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, slow, careful, and following a rhythm that somehow matched mine as I sat still. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just hearing what I wanted to hear, but the sound continued intermittently. Every now and then, I caught a shadow out of the corner of my eye, a movement too fast, too purposeful to be a deer. I didn't have a phone signal, and I hadn't told anyone my exact location. Panic started to creep in. I packed away the stove and decided to sleep in my tent early, thinking that maybe hiding inside and pretending I was just another part of the forest would be the safest option. Sleep didn't come easily. Every snap, every rustle made me tense up. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a loud rustling, almost right at the edge of my tent. I could hear heavy breathing, or maybe it was just the wind, but it was close enough to make my skin crawl. My instinct was to stay perfectly still, trying to convince myself that if I didn't move, whoever or whatever it was wouldn't know I was there. Then I heard something worse. The sound of deliberate scraping, like someone dragging a boot over the dirt, circling the tent. My stomach sank. This wasn't an animal. No animal moves like this. My mind raced, trying to come up with options. I could run, but that might provoke whoever it was. I had no weapon, just a small camping knife. The noise went on for what felt like hours, but I know it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Eventually, it stopped. I stayed inside the tent, frozen, every muscle tight. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. There were footprints, too large for any deer, with the sole pattern clearly human, circling my tent, and they continued toward the woods on the other side of the clearing. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear. Whoever it was had left. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make any noise, and started walking back toward the trailhead. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but I kept my senses sharp. I moved fast, scanning for movement and avoiding obvious cover where someone could hide. The trail felt longer on the way back, every shadow now a potential threat. I finally reached my car around mid-morning, exhausted and tense, but grateful. I didn't see anyone else, didn't hear anything unusual beyond the normal forest sounds. The relief of being in my car, doors locked and engine running, was immediate. I started driving down the dirt road, constantly checking the rearview mirror. A few weeks later, I read a local news story about a man who had been living in the woods not far from where I camped. He had been spotted by hikers before being arrested for following and harassing people, sometimes for days, before they managed to escape. It was a reminder that the forest, no matter how beautiful, can also hide dangers that are completely human. The trip taught me a few things. 1, always tell someone exactly where you're going. 2, trust your instincts, especially when something feels wrong. And 3, sometimes fear isn't about monsters or the unknown. It's about people, and they can be just as terrifying. I never went back to that part of the Appalachians, and I always camped in areas with other people nearby after that. It was a scary experience, but it also made me more aware of my surroundings, more cautious, and strangely, more capable of handling unexpected situations. Even though that night was terrifying, I made it out safely, and I came back with a story that reminded me that the wilderness isn't just about nature. It's about respect, awareness, and sometimes sheer luck. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 22, craving a weekend away from the constant buzz of my city job in Denver. I decided to drive out alone to a small, remote area in the Rocky Mountains that I had read about in an old hiking forum. The place was called Black Pine Creek, and the posts online promised solitude and some of the clearest streams for fishing. I packed my car with a small backpack, tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of beans, bottled water, my hiking boots, and my rifle just in case. I liked being careful, especially since the area was known for occasional bear sightings. The drive up was long, twisting through dense forest and narrow dirt roads. But by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already low in the sky, staining the mountains a rusty orange. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, like the world had swallowed sound. No cars, no planes, just the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional rustle of pine needles. I parked near a small clearing, where a few scattered pine trees gave just enough space to pitch my tent. The ground was damp, soft with fallen needles, and the air smelled sharp and clean. I could feel the cool mountain breeze brushing against my skin, a welcome relief from the heat of the valley below. I set up my tent with practiced ease, hammered the stakes in, and laid out my sleeping bag. After that, I wandered down to the creek, just as the last of the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks. The water was fast and icy, tumbling over rocks and making a soothing, constant noise. I filled my water bottle and crouched by the bank, testing my fishing line. Nothing bit, but I didn't mind. I had plenty of food, and somehow the quiet was enough. As darkness fully settled, I lit a small campfire. The flames danced in the shadows, flickering across the rough bark of the surrounding pines. I felt a certain satisfaction in the simplicity of the night. The smell of burning wood, the chill in the air, the distant call of an owl. I cooked my beans, ate slowly, and watched the stars begin to appear, bright and countless in the mountain sky. Around 10:30 p.m., I decided to crawl into my tent. I left the fire smoldering low, careful not to leave anything flammable nearby. The first hour was peaceful, the kind of quiet that lulls you into thinking you're completely alone in the world. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes, listening to the creek. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible crunching. Someone or something was walking on the forest floor, and it wasn't far. My first instinct was to convince myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were deliberate, heavy, not light and random like a small animal would make. My heart rate spiked. I lay still, straining to listen. The crunching stopped. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but then a low snap of a branch sounded even closer. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. The darkness outside seemed thicker than before, oppressive. I could make out a vague shape moving between the trees, crouched low, and I realized it wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. My stomach dropped. I had brought my rifle, but I had left it in the car, thinking the odds of encountering another human here were slim. I cursed myself quietly, trying not to panic. For the next 30 minutes, I sat in the tent, barely breathing, listening to intermittent noises. A soft rustle of branches, the faint scrape of something against a tree. The thought that someone might be watching me, tracking me, made the hair on my neck stand on end. My flashlight was in my backpack, but I didn't want to risk turning it on. Whoever it was, they were stealthy, cautious. Finally, I heard a voice, low and unintelligible, muttering to itself. It was human, but it was far enough away that I couldn't make out words. The panic I had been holding in suddenly surged. I realized the fire I had left burning could be seen, giving away my exact location. I needed to move, but where? The creek ran on one side, and dense forest surrounded the other sides. There was only one road, half a mile uphill, but moving in the dark could be dangerous. I waited, trying to listen for any pattern. The voice faded, replaced by the sound of rapid movement, feet crashing through underbrush. Whoever it was, they were moving away. I waited a full 5 minutes, counting slowly in my head before I dared to unzip the tent and peek. The fire was still there, mostly intact, but the figure was gone. My relief was cautious, knowing the person could return at any moment. I made a decision. I grabbed my backpack, tossed in the essentials, and carefully crawled out of the tent. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground as I moved quietly but deliberately toward my car, keeping the trees between me and the clearing as much as possible. Every snap of a twig made me freeze. Once I reached the road, I didn't look back. I ran, slipping on loose gravel, scratching my hands on branches, but I didn't stop until I was back in the car, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I started the engine, fumbling with the keys, and drove immediately, keeping the headlights dimmed, hugging the edges of the narrow dirt road. Every shadow looked like someone hiding. Every distant noise set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached the main road and saw the glow of distant houses, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I drove straight back to Denver, not stopping once. Later, I learned from a park ranger that there had been reports of people camping illegally and sometimes harassing other campers in that area. Some were known to follow people around the forest at night, looking for opportunities to steal or intimidate. It made sense now, the deliberate steps, the low voice, the way the figure vanished without a trace. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me something important. Preparedness is everything. I bought a more secure camping spot after that, one with better ranger oversight, and I never left my rifle in the car again. I still hike and camp, but I've learned to respect the isolation and the people who might not have good intentions. Even years later, I can remember the sound of those heavy steps, the feeling of being watched in the dark, and the relief when the road finally appeared through the trees. That night was terrifying. Yes, but I survived, and I survived by staying calm, moving carefully, and trusting my instincts. The mountains were still beautiful, the creek still clear, and I haven't let fear stop me from enjoying them. But I will never forget how close I came to being completely exposed, alone, in the dark. I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday, even though it was in 2019 and I was 23. I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the remote stretches of northern Arizona, around the Coconino National Forest. I'd been camping plenty before, mostly in spots with other people around, but this time I wanted total isolation. I told no one exactly where I was going. My plan was simple: hike in, find a quiet clearing near a dry wash, set up camp, and spend 3 days alone in the woods. I arrived late afternoon. The forest was dense, but the sun was still high enough to light the trail, though the shadows were long. I carried a small backpack with a tent, food, water, and my old hunting knife. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was rough, full of loose rocks and fallen branches. At some point, I realized I had wandered off the official path. It didn't bother me. I actually liked the idea of being somewhere almost no one visited. By the time I found the clearing, the sun was low, and the forest around me was already darkening. I set up my tent quickly, wanting to get a fire going before night fully fell. The dry wood in the area made it easy, and soon I had a small fire crackling, the smoke drifting into the trees. Felt peaceful. Birds were quieting down, and the forest seemed to inhale the day, preparing for night. I ate a simple meal, a few sandwiches and some jerky, and then just sat near the fire, letting the silence sink in. That's when I first noticed the sound, a twig snapping off in the distance. First, I thought it was a deer. The forest had plenty of wildlife. But then I heard another snap closer this time. I froze. It wasn't walking like a deer, and the timing felt wrong. Too deliberate, too measured. I tried to dismiss it. Probably a coyote, I told myself, though the sound of coyotes is usually more distant, almost yipping or howling. Not this slow, careful stepping. Night fell completely, and the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire reduced to glowing embers. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Something or someone was circling the clearing. My gut tightened. I had been alone in the forest plenty of times, and I knew the difference between normal wildlife and this. I reached for my knife, keeping it in my hand under the sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Total silence. My ears strained to catch anything. Then I heard breathing, not human, not animal, but something in between. I don't know how else to describe it. It was deep, wet, almost rattling, and it didn't move like a normal animal's. I stayed still, heart hammering. The air felt thick, almost charged. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the smell hit me first. Something foul, like rotting meat mixed with damp soil. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that whatever it was watching me. I remembered something I had read once, a story in a magazine about people seeing skinwalkers in these exact woods. They described them as creatures that could imitate human movements, walking upright, blending in with the dark. I shook my head. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but right then, logic didn't help. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, barely breathing. Every so often, I'd hear movement, sometimes a snap, sometimes a rustle in the brush. Once I saw it, or thought I did, a shadow at the edge of the firelight. A tall figure, hunched slightly, moving in a way that was human, but not quite right. Its limbs seemed too long, too thin, and its head tilted in a way that no human would. Morning came slowly. I didn't sleep at all. When the first pale light filtered through the trees, I saw the tracks. Large, oddly shaped footprints circled my clearing multiple times, then disappeared into the thicker forest. They were too long to be human, and the spacing between them was strange, like whoever or whatever walked in a loping, uneven rhythm. I decided then that I had to leave. Slowly, carefully, I packed up my tent and supplies, trying not to make noise. I didn't look back, but I could feel eyes on me. The forest felt wrong. The shadows were too heavy, the silence too thick. As I hiked out, I kept checking behind me. I thought I saw movement in the trees, glimpses of something tall and thin, keeping pace at a distance. Every time I tried to run, it stopped. Every time I slowed, it seemed to creep closer. I finally reached a spot where I could see the main trail. Relief flooded me. I picked up my pace, moving as fast as I could without tripping. The forest behind me was still dense, dark, and silent, but I didn't hear any more footsteps. I didn't stop until I reached my car hours later, sweating and shaking. I drove straight to the nearest town and stayed in a motel for the night. I called my best friend in the morning, told him roughly where I had been, but didn't tell him about the full details. He wouldn't have believed me. I didn't go back. I haven't camped in that part of the forest since. What made it scarier wasn't just seeing it or hearing it. It was knowing that something that shouldn't exist was out there, somewhere watching, patient. It didn't chase me in the way an animal would. It just observed, and it was waiting. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that clearing, that heavy, wrong shadow standing just at the edge of firelight. I've thought about going back, but every time I consider it, my stomach twists. That forest is different to me now. I know what's out there, what moves in ways it shouldn't, and I respect it. Not out of fear alone, but out of understanding that some things in the wild aren't meant to be found. I've kept my camping trips to places that are open and busy since then. I stick to trails and campgrounds with other people. I still hike, still enjoy the outdoors, but I never again wanted the kind of silence that lets a creature like that watch you for hours without a sound. The ending, the part that really stays with me, isn't just that I escaped. It's that the forest wasn't empty, and it never will be. It was a reminder that some parts of the world operate on rules we don't understand. And that's fine. I didn't need to understand it to know I didn't want to meet it again. That day, I learned that survival isn't always about running or fighting. Sometimes, it's about noticing, respecting, and leaving before you're noticed yourself. And that's what I did.